You're muted.
Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with an amazing lineup of speakers who are with us tonight to honor the life and work of the late Jon Bradshaw and to celebrate the publication of a much anticipated anthology of his writings, The Ocean is Closed: Journalistic Adventures and Investigations, published by Z Books. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to pose questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of The Ocean is Closed from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. To kick the evening off and begin introducing our guests, we'll be joined by Michael Zilkha, the publisher of Z Books, which he founded in 2019. Prior to that, Michael was involved in natural gas exploration and then renewable energy in Houston, Texas, where he has lived since 1986. From 1978 to 1984, he ran Z Records in New York City. Michael had several jobs in magazine publishing when he first moved to New York and spent 2 years as an editor at Atlantic Monthly Press under Harold Evans. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Michael to the virtual stage. Hang on. Hi, Michael.
Hi. Thank you so much, Christina and Mitch, for hosting our celebration for Bradshaw's The Ocean is Closed. And thank you to all of this event's participants. Many of us are experiencing Zoom event fatigue, but it would not have been possible to assemble such a stellar cast in one place. I moved to New York City in the summer of 1975, 2 months after Jon Bradshaw and Anna Wintour. We were friends through Anna's brother Patrick, my best friend and one of my editors at ISIS, the Oxford University magazine. I was freelancing for the Village Voice and other publications, and Bradshaw sometimes took on Patrick's role with a final polish to my articles pre-submission. Bradshaw, Anna, and I were inseparable that first year in New York, visiting jazz clubs, CBGBs, many repertory cinemas, and eating for free at Maxwell's Plum because Bradshaw had put the restaurant on the cover of New York Magazine. Bradshaw was crucial in terms of refining my literary tastes. He also shaped my career path because he introduced me to Chris Blackwell, who financed and distributed my record company, Z Records. Chris and I both keep a photograph of Bradshaw on our desk to this day. It was a pleasure reliving that period as Bradshaw's widow, Carolyn Pfeiffer, Alex Belth, and I developed The Ocean is Closed. And I hope the world will view it as a fitting memorial to a very fine journalist and human being. I started Z Books 2 years ago, specifically to publish a remembrance of my friend Glenn O'Brien, who died in April 2017. This volume of Bradshaw's is effectively its pendant. I am now delighted to turn this over to Anna, who so kindly agreed to co-host with me.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the memories, and welcome to the Books and Books community. This book is such a moving tribute to Jon Bradshaw and brings back such wonderful memories for all of us that knew him. Bradshaw was the epitome of good company. Someone you always wanted to be around for his humor and his charm, and of course for his talent, his audacity, his ability to work a room and entertain and be entertained by others. The Ocean is Closed is a little bit like having him around again. It's very good company as well. There weren't too many people like Bradshaw, or certainly there weren't when I first met him in London. The thing that struck me above all was that he was so American, but American in the very best way, meaning open and not so careful as the British world that I had grown up in. He was incredibly good looking and very intelligent and charming, and of course, he was so much fun. And talented. His writing and journalism, which this book gives its proper due, is full of style. It has rigor, it has precision and swagger. It feels both careful and wonderfully free. These pieces for magazines like Esquire and New York, which he began writing for when he and I moved together to New York in the 70s, remind me how voracious he was in his own reading and what an acute observer he was of other people and of places and, of course, of parties. There was no one better at capturing a scene and creating one as well. Bradshaw was equally good at making you laugh and, of course, at laughing at himself. He had his faults and excesses, but that was part of him too. Bradshaw left us all too soon, but this magical book brings him back, and I'm so thrilled to have it out in the world. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Carolyn. And I'd now like to introduce my friend Julian Sands, who I believe is locked in a hotel room in Hong Kong for the past 3 weeks, quarantining before making a film with Mike Figgis. We are so grateful to Julian for agreeing to read Bradshaw's memorable profile of Tom Stoppard. Over to you, Julian.
Tom Stoppard, Non-Stop, New York, January the 10th, 1977. The Quality Inn is an inferior hostelry in the upper reaches of Regent Street. 2 men entered the inn and took a booth toward the back. The taller man, a playwright, carried a large leather bag. For reasons which later escaped him, the shorter man, a journalist, assumed it was filled with plays. He had been drinking seriously since noon, and his perceptions were not what they had been before lunch. The playwright wore a blue imitation leather suit, purple shoes emblazoned with red stars, and a black and white scarf, into which was knitted in red the word travesties. The journalist was certain of that. He drank his tea. The tea was rank and bagged. Lifting his hand, he summoned a waiter. "May I have a drink?" he said. "Only if you have something to eat." "I don't want anything to eat." "Supposing I have something to eat," said the playwright. "Can he have something to drink?" "No, it's against the rules." "Supposing I have something to drink," said the journalist. "Can he have something to eat?" "I don't understand," said the waiter. The journalist pushed the tea bag through the murky tea. "Where shall we begin?" "Why don't I give you a prepared statement?" the playwright said. "Actually, I'm quite prepared for interviews. I've always been interviewing myself, or at least I used to. I don't have to interview myself anymore because people come and do it for me," he grinned. "Mind you, they don't do it as well as I do. I must tell you," he continued, "there's something you should know right away. I'll say anything to an interviewer. But somewhere in the middle of the piece, there ought to be a warning, like on cigarette packets, a warning which states, this profile is in the middle truth range. Don't inhale. And that's the point, since a profile shows just one side of somebody, a very good term for this particular kind of journalism. And which side do you intend to show? The outside. I mean, that's what I like about interviews. Now, I suppose you'll want some sort of background, the facts, the wheres and whens. Yes, I suppose, but don't exaggerate. "Oh, I'm very good at giving boring interviews," he said. I can say, yes, my name is Tom Stoppard, and yes, I'm 39, and yes, I left school at 17 and joined the Western Daily Press as a junior reporter in 1954, and joined the Bristol Evening World in 1958, and yes, I began to write Rosencrantz and Guildenstern in 1964. I'm very good at that, no problem. Wait while I get some cigarettes, and I'll tell you some more. He walked off to the back of the restaurant. The facts, to dispense with them immediately, were more than a little surprising. He was born in Czechoslovakia in 1937. Both his parents were Czech. He had an older brother. Shortly before the outbreak of World War II, the four of them were sent to Singapore, quite the wrong place to go since shortly after the Japanese invaded. The Stoppards were evacuated to India. Stoppard's father remained behind and died in Japanese captivity. They spent the rest of the war in India, in Calcutta and in Darjeeling, where Stoppard attended the American multiracial school. In late 1945, his mother married an Englishman serving in the British Army, who early in 1946 brought them to England. My stepfather's name was Stoppard, the playwright said, returning to the booth. My father's name was Straussler, like the composer, with le at the end, he smiled. As you can see, Thomas Straussler sits before you. Is that all? Yes, I'm afraid that's it. I have never starved, never lived in a garret, and I've never had TB. The playwright ordered another cup of tea. When I left school, he said, I wanted to be a great journalist. My first ambition was to be lying on the floor of an African airport while machine gun bullets zoomed over my typewriter. But I wasn't much good as a reporter. I felt I didn't have the right to ask people questions. I always thought they'd throw the teapot at me or call the police. For me, it was like knocking at the door, wearing your reporter's peaked cap and saying, hello, I'm from journalism. I've come to inspect you. Take off your clothes and lie down. But I wasn't much good at it, and I never got to Fleet Street. Early on in my career, I had an interview with Mr. Charles Wintour, the editor of the Evening Standard. At one point, Mr. Wintour asked me if I were interested in politics. Thinking all journalists should be interested in politics, I told him I was. He then asked me who the current Home Secretary was. Of course, I had no idea who the current Home Secretary was, and in any event, it was an unfair question. I'd only admitted to an interest in politics. I hadn't claimed I was obsessed with the subject. But I'm through with all that now. I gave up journalism and became a playwright. But you have no objections to seeing journalists who have come to inspect you? No, but I'm wary of them. Do you see what I'm saying? The playwright paused to light a cigarette. I feel I should preface this with an epigram, which is, nothing is more studied than a repeated spontaneity. And on that note, I'll repeat what I said to you the other day. You see, the updated supposition to any interviewing situation is that I know the answers to the questions you're asking. And there are certain kinds of questions to which I do indeed know the answers. If you ask me how tall I am, I'll say 6'1". And tomorrow, if you ask me again, I'll say the same thing, unless, of course, I've grown. But if you ask me what I think of Virginia Woolf, then the answer would have a different status. What do you think of Virginia Woolf? Well, in my opinion, Virginia Woolf was the tallest woman writer of the 20s. Are you quite sure? Yes, my information is that Catherine Mansfield was only 4'11", and Edith Sitwell was only 5'3", but Virginia Woolf was 6'8", a fact not commonly known, the playwright laughed. Actually, life would be very simple if writers were judged by measurable criteria. Now, as a matter of fact, I don't know if I'm 6'1" because I haven't measured myself lately, but then I would be being merely inaccurate, which is a different kind of mistake. Do you see? I often give a frivolous answer to a serious question, which is a kind of a lie. I don't lie about my age or the number of bathrooms in my house. But if you ask me whether I write comedy because I'm too insecure to make a serious statement, well, that's a complex question. And rather than getting into it, it's much easier to say yes. One doesn't tell lies. I now have a repertoire of plausible answers which evade the whole truth. It just goes wrong. The truth slips away and becomes something you probably won't mean tomorrow. You could, of course, have a prepared statement, and when a newshand knocked at the door, you could slide it out to him, said the journalist. Yes, or it would be very funny to have the answers written on cards and do tricks. You could say to the interviewer, now listen, take a card, any card, okay? Don't tell me what it is, okay? Now, ask me a question. Right, now look at the card. Got it? The two men paid the bill and left the restaurant. You know, if every card said maybe, you could get away with that, the playwright said. The two men walked hurriedly up Great Newport Street. It was still raining, and they were late for a performance of Stoppard's latest play, Dirty Linen. It's raining, the playwright said. Let's duck into the nearest theatre. Entering the crowded theatre, the playwright was recognized by several of the lingering astute, and a flurry of whispers rose in his wake. The two men retreated to the upstairs bar. How many times have you seen Dirty Linen? Said the journalist. 12, said the playwright, and it gets better every other time. Moments later, the bell rang and the two men took their seats. The playwright took pen and paper from his leather bag in order to make notes on the performance. It was a habit of his to stop in from time to time to assure himself and the actors that matters were running smoothly. The house lights went down. The play began, and one was soon immersed in jokes, tautologies and puns, wisecracks and japes, non sequiturs, absurd conceits, and epigrams, followed about an hour later by the curtain and much applause. A man sitting 2 seats away turned to his wife and said, "Is that the end?" The two men returned to the bar. Dirty Linen sort of grew like Topsy, really, the playwright said. Ed Berman, the director, would have been perfectly happy if I turned in a 25-minute sketch, which is all I'd intended to do, because I didn't have any ideas and because I couldn't think of a sketch relating to his own particular needs, which were for a season of plays about America or something to do with America. I ended up using an idea I'd saved for some other occasion. And that idea was to have a play about a committee of very high-powered people. I was thinking of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Prime Minister, the equivalent of Einstein, some guy doing nuclear physics, a theologian, a philosopher, and they were going to have this committee meeting on some topic worthy of their brain power. And there was going to be this staggering bird who was there to sharpen the pencils and pass the water carafe around. And I was going to have her correcting them on the points of theology and nuclear physics in a very bland sort of way. I hadn't developed the idea beyond that single notion of dislocating the category of dumb blondes. You see, finally, out of despair, you know, the usual deadline trouble, I began writing the play in the form of a committee meeting to debate Ed Berman's application for British citizenship. Got sick of that, decided to hell with Berman's American problem, and just wrote Dirty Linen. And then, you see, because there is a God and he does look after writers, I realized that all I had to do was to have an adjournment, put in 15 minutes about America, and I'd solve Berman's problem as well. And the whole thing is a nonsense, of course, little more than an extended joke. What are you doing next? What next? Well, I've written a sort of play which involves 6 actors and a symphony orchestra. The setting is contemporary, political in its implications to do with human rights, and the treatment is tragicomic. The idea, which was suggested by Andre Previn, appealed as much as anything to my incipient megalomania. I think I just love the idea of having 100 musicians in a play. And I'm very in awe of conductors. Apart from Evel Knievel, I think the conductor of a great orchestra is the most awesome figure on earth. You see, ultimately, before being carried out feet first, I would like to have done a bit of absolutely everything, really without any evidence of any talent in those other directions. I find it very hard to turn down offers to write an underwater ballet for dolphins or a play for a motorcyclist on the Wall of Death. That's why I did this with André Previn. No one ever asked me to write a play with a symphony orchestra before. Probably no one ever will again. The theatre was empty now, but for a few of the actors who had come up to the bar to chat with the playwright and to have a drink before going home. Are you bothered much with urgent requests for people seeking meaning in your work? The journalist said. Not often, but often enough to be irritating, he said. You see, plays are written to entertain. They're theatrical. I don't want to be disobliging or churlish to people who are invariably nice and are paying me a real compliment in asking academic questions about my plays. But I do insist on making the point that they aren't written to be studied and discussed. No plays are written to be studied and discussed any more than pictures are painted to be discussed. The lit crit industry is now approaching the dimensions of ITT. It reminds me of a very good footnote to an edition of Goethe's letters. Goethe was saying something like, "And now I fell in love for the first time." And in the footnote, the editor says, "Here Goethe was mistaken. In 18, you know." What about the style of your work? You've been accused of being all style and no substance, said the journalist. Not quite. In my own work, I think if you took away the style, the gift for putting things in certain ways, if you took that away and rewrote everything so that it was pedestrian, but said the same thing, then you would have a residue of a certain number of things worth saying, but not worth listening to. I don't think I would say that of, say, Oscar Wilde. I think Wilde was motivated by style, which is a different thing. With Wilde, style was not merely the means, it was the end. In my own work, the distinction between style and substance is never quite as clear as an academic might wish it to be. I'm not a writer who doesn't care what things mean and who doesn't care if there isn't any meaning. But despite myself, I am a kind of writer who doesn't give a fair crack of the whip to that meaning. The plays tend to give an impression of effervescence and style and wit for their own sake, and thereby obscure what to me is the core of the toffee apple. The toffee apple. A toffee apple, American readers, is a sort of hot dog, taken from Sanskrit. Toff, meaning hot, and ap, a sort of dog. Are you prepared to stand by that? Well, I write fiction because it's a way of making statements I can disown. And I write plays because dialogue is the most respectable way of contradicting myself. Not bad, said the journalist. May I quote you on that? There's no point in being quoted if one isn't going to be quotable, the playwright said. Thank you.
Julian, that was magical. And the story of Tom being interviewed by my dad is part of my own personal family history. It's wonderful to hear it in that context, and what an extraordinary piece, and how well you read it. Thank you.
My pleasure.
It's now my pleasure to introduce Alex Belth, the editor of The Ocean is Closed, who will lead our panel discussion. Alex is the editor of Esquire Classics and the Stax Reader, and his work has appeared in Sports Illustrated, Esquire, The Daily Beast, and Deadspin. Over to you, Alex, and thank you for this extraordinary book.
Thank you so much, Anna. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Mitch and Christina, everyone at Book and Books, as well as Michael Zilka, for this event. I'm going to be joined momentarily with 3 panel guests that we'll be interviewing tonight. And as they loop themselves in, let me just give you my story and how I came across Bradshaw. As the editor of Esquire Classic, I made it my, I guess, the best part of the job is to find great writers from the past that might not necessarily be on the tips of everyone's minds today. Esquire magazine, for those who don't know, is a men's fashion magazine that has a real literary pedigree from its beginning days when Hemingway and Fitzgerald were in the first issue in 1933. But by the 1960s and 1970s, literary nonfiction became part of the magazine's real DNA. And Bradshaw was one of, a handful of journalists that did wonderful work for Esquire in the 1970s. And so as part of my job, I ran into Bradshaw's stuff, and I thought, wow, this guy is great. He's writing about street gangs in the Bronx in the late 70s. He's writing about the Baader Meinhof, German terrorism. So I did a quick Google search on him, found out that he passed away, that he died unreasonably young. Also, coincidentally, that he was born in 1937, the same year my father was born, which interested me immediately. And so I looked up and found out he had a New York Times obit, and read through the obit, seemed like a fascinating guy, and found his widow, Carolyn Pfeiffer, listed there. Looked Carolyn up, and she is just this unbelievably fantastic person who's lived an incredible life. Also an American who met Bradshaw originally in London in the 1960s. Carolyn has an unbelievable story, and we're fortunate enough that she's writing a memoir that's going to be out next year, in which we will be able to learn more about it. But I got in touch with Carolyn, and she was terrific. And she says, I have a friend, Michael Zilka, who wants to put out a collection of Bradshaw's stuff. And so within a day or two, I had spoken to Michael, and I was brought onto this project. And so I went down to Marfa, Texas to visit Carolyn. I don't know if Bradshaw had ever been to Marfa himself, but for those of you who don't know, it takes a little ways to get to Marfa and from New York City. And there was something about having to travel a certain distance to find Bradshaw's stuff. And I don't mean just the articles, but the ephemera that we were able to put in this book, illustrations, passports, all parts of, journalist tools of the trade. And so I traveled to Marfa and had this great experience with Carolyn. And then Carolyn and Michael opened up their Rolodexes. Sorry to date myself saying a Rolodex, but they opened up their contacts and they introduced me to all of these friends of Bradshaw's. And I had an absolutely unbelievable time getting to know Bradshaw through his friends, many of whom are watching with us tonight. And, what's amazing is Bradshaw died 5 years before the internet was created. And yet, because of the internet, we are all able to be here tonight. And so I did want to take this moment just before I introduce the panel to raise a glass, put one in the air, chin, chin, raise a glass, and let's just have a toast here for Bradshaw. I am so glad that you guys get to be here and experience this with us. And I am just looking to see when the rest of our folks are coming in, but they should be here momentarily. I can, of course, vamp because talking about anything is really not too difficult. And as we wait for Scott and Anne and Adam to come aboard, just to set a little bit more context, and there's Anne. Anne is first. And Adam.
Hi there.
Last but not least, Scott's in the pocket. He's coming. You know what? I think what I'll do is, as we're waiting for Scott, our last panelist, I am going to introduce our first two. Ann Taylor Fleming is with us from California. She is the Associate Director of the Sun Valley Writers Conference. She is a memoirist, a novelist, as well as a print and television journalist. She's worked for the New York Times Magazine, and she's been a columnist for the New York Times. And her articles have appeared in Vogue and the New Yorker and Los Angeles Magazine. She was also a radio commentator for CBS, a television commentator for NBC, and a longtime essayist for the NewsHour at PBS, where her work won a Gracie Award from the Foundation of American Women in Radio and Television. Ann, welcome. And Adam Moss is also with us tonight. Adam actually got his career started at Esquire magazine in the 1980s, doing a host of editorial jobs, including serving as managing editor. He went on to edit a fabulous short-lived magazine. It's got a kind of cult following in New York called 7 Days. And after that, Adam went on to great success at the New York Times Magazine, and then for 15 years, memorably at New York Magazine, shepherding a whole huge digital transition for that brand. Adam, welcome.
Thank you, Alex.
We have one more guest, Scott Berg, who will be with us in a moment. But before Scott gets on, Adam, I figure we could start with you. You know, you started working in the magazine business in the late 70s, early 80s. Can you tell us a little bit about what Esquire was like, and also just what the tenor and the atmosphere of magazine journalism was like at that moment?
Okay, I'll start with Esquire. That's the easier part. So Esquire in 1981, when I got there, was in a weird, interesting transition. It had been this, marvelous kind of literary and fashion gentleman's magazine during the period you were describing before, started by Arnold Gingrich, had just come through during the 60s, this absolutely thrilling period for magazine journalism when Harold Hayes was the editor. And then it had a sort of short interregnum when it was turned into a fortnightly that Clay Felker, who had later would do New York Magazine, or earlier would do New York Magazine, had edited, and then it was bought by these two guys from Tennessee, a guy named Chris Whittle and another guy who was the editor named Philip Moffat. And what Philip did, because he was kind of green to magazine editing, is he assembled all of the great editors of Esquire during the sort of Harold Hayes era, and hired them as a kind of like kitchen cabinet. So it was a magazine that was still kind of suffused with the ghosts of the old Esquire in a wonderful way, but that Philip also had this impulse towards a magazine that would understand the kind of yuppie that was being kind of born during this period. And he also had an enormous sensitivity to like the new age. So it was this kind of weird fusion of the ghosts of Esquire past, and then weird sort of spiritual bent, and a strong and actually quite prescient material bearing. So for me as a kid, to be able to be at this magazine with all of these old legends of magazinedom, who weren't that old actually, but they felt to me like, this was Mount Rushmore of magazine editing. It was like completely thrilling. Because I also, like you, I think, had this great romance about the old daring do era of sort of swashbuckling magazineness.
That's right.
So that was the situation when I got there. And magazines were in this weird transition also between this other period that I was describing, the sort of more literary period, and a kind of more glittery, dazzling, Ronald Reagan was president. There was like I mean, magazines are very sensitive to zeitgeist. And so it was moving along with the zeitgeist, and it was sort of caught between these two eras.
Mm-hmm. And so in this moment then, and certainly when magazines are a part of the lifeblood of our culture in a real vibrant way, how does Bradshaw fit into all of that?
Well, I'm going to date myself because I knew Harold Hayes real well. I think I'm in the ghost category. I mean, I started writing for magazines roughly in the mid-'70s when Bradshaw was writing for magazines. So I'm part of a slightly earlier incarnation. The thing that was wonderful reading the pieces of Bradshaw, I think I said this to you, is I hadn't read Bradshaw's pieces in years. And when we first talked about Bradshaw, the thing that comes to mind, I don't know if this is true with you, Adam, as well, is the person he was and the persona he was. And, Anna talks about the joy and the charisma. I don't think I've ever met anybody as immediately captivating in a room as Jon Bradshaw. And it wasn't theatrical. It wasn't effortful. It wasn't look at me. It was he emanated a kind of life force and a joy. I mean, I laughed harder and had more fun with Bradshaw in a room. And, he could pepper it with the literary references and whatnot. And I'll come back to that. I just want to talk about the work for a minute. But reading the pieces in this collection, I was struck by, it is an earlier turn of journalism. And it is literary. And it is sort of what happened to journalism. It became so full of attitude. And Bradshaw's pieces are not that. They're careful. He's there in them, but he's not overbearing. Again, it's not to look at me. I was struck at how good they were. I don't know if you had that sense, Adam, but when rereading or listening to the Stoppard, but the first piece on Auden.
Yeah, it's great.
It's just great. I mean, and you come away saying, I was in that room with Auden, that cranky old poet, that remarkable cranky old poet. I knew the weather. I knew where he lived. I knew what he ate. I knew who he didn't know. Who was it that we were talking about that he didn't, he was listening to a record?
Well, he had no idea who Ella Fitzgerald was.
Right.
But they were listening to Nichols and May albums.
Right.
Like late into the night, drinking port wine and listening to Nichols and May, he thought they were brilliantly hilarious, And
what you come away with, the accretion of detail, and that's what I had forgotten, the reportage, the sheer amount of work, reporting work. And if somebody went to do a major poet now, there would be so much attitude. And it would be when I was with, and so looks like this. I was struck by how thrilling it was in many ways to see that old form of journalism. And as much as the guys were coming, like Gay Talese and Nora Ephron, and they were fantastic, Bradshaw had a quieter persona on the page, even though I think his persona in person was ever more lively, perhaps. I don't know if any of this is resonant.
No. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, Adam, that piece on Auden that he did was his first Esquire piece, and that was in 1970. So that was still the Harold Hayes years.
Yeah.
But his prose style is a little bit on the understated style. Yeah. It's the era of a writer who would have been influenced, if not directly by Hemingway, then just a little bit removed from Hemingway, the flat, unadorned prose style. But that Auden piece, literary figures, that fit right in line with what Esquire was doing in that
right.
time, didn't it?
And you can't imagine a magazine publishing a story like that these days.
Right.
Not very much of one, for a lot of reasons. I mean, for one thing, it was on a poet, even if it was, and it was about a poet who was a sort of world famous celebrity poet, which more or less doesn't exist anymore. But also the piece itself was cranky. It was moody. It had kind of literary, you can sort of see the color really as you're reading it. And it was, and while they were different, I think journalists of that era, they were the sort of showy journalists like a Tom Woolf, where the voice would be everything, or not really, actually. I think he's more sophisticated than that, but the voice would be very prominent. And then Gay Talese was also a rather subdued voice.
Yeah.
And Bradshaw was part of that tradition. And but what all of them had in common was that the stories themselves were structured in a literary manner. Mm-hmm. They were indirect. Mm-hmm. They were the sort of pacing of it was not the pacing you see in journalism today, which is pretty much like quote thought, set up quote thought. I mean, there's a real kind of rhythm, and there's some great journalism being done these days. But there's not the kind of sort of appreciation for shaping a nonfiction story with some of the grace that came out of the sort of Irwin Shaw or the short stories that someone like Bradshaw revered. And all of the writers of that, they were competing with each other, but they were also competing with, the great fiction writers. And that's not an aspiration that you'll see in journalism so much today.
And Bradshaw was a literary guy. I mean, he would have considered himself a man of letters. I mean, he collected first edition books, and he was an autodidact more than anything. I mean, I think, he told stories about going to college, but he never finished college. But he was somebody who could hold his own if he was having a conversation with Martin Amis or Christopher Hitchens. He was well read. He wasn't, out of his league in that way. Adam,
but he could turn a phrase. I'm sorry, there was just a phrase. I was looking at the book again today. Every now and again, he'd throw a phrase in that stopped me, and he was talking about Chris Blackwell. His name came up before and he said something about him having unspeakable sanity. And I stopped. I'm going to carry that with me from now on, because the idea of having unspeakable sanity. Yeah. I mean, there are those marvelous little things that he did in the middle of this literary pacing. Is a wonderful word, Adam. I love that pacing, and you know it well as an editor, a brilliant editor, I might add. Oh, but seriously, the New York Times Magazine belongs in your hands, but it is, he took his time. He let you see the as in a story. And you could see that even in the Stoppard thing. You come away seeing the gamesmanship of Stoppard, but you also see a lot of what's under the gamesmanship of Stoppard. I mean, and then the Hunter Thompson piece, which we talked about, which God knows you couldn't get printed now for all of the crazy, misogynistic, hysterical, awful things Hunter Thompson said. But Bradshaw let him show himself to us. That's a remarkable piece. If you want to know who Hunter Thompson was, you can read that piece and you get all of the absolute raging craziness and difficulty, and maybe some of the talent of Hunter Thompson. But I'm pleased to say that I have been struck by this collection in ways that I was surprised by. And I think Scott, I'll speak for Scott, my beloved Scott, who hasn't turned up. He and I have talked about this book and had the same reaction, because both of our memories, Scott and I spent a lot of time with Bradshaw and Carolyn in the later years, or his later years, which were not so late. And we had so much fun. It was just insane. So when Bradshaw's name comes up, Bradshaw we would have inebriated, I wouldn't say drunken, ping pong games after dinner that went on into midnight, everybody laughing and literary references and food. And Bradshaw had no malice. I think of people that I care about to be around. And I hadn't thought about how much I miss Bradshaw until you called me. That there was all of that, but without the cynicism, without the malice, maybe some melancholy that has come up in people's conversation about him. I don't know what evenings you spent with him, Adam, but there was he led with joy, and it filled up a room. I mean, when he came in, you felt better about being on the earth at the same time he was on the earth. And I think that's why a lot of people, I feel badly speaking for all the people, or feel bad speaking for the people who are probably lined up, because they're all going to have the same kinds of memories of Bradshaw, a time and a place and a party and a joy and a something. So
yeah, and the book also to me was a revelation. I mean, my experience with Bradshaw was when I was at Esquire, he was attempting to write the second to last piece in the book. It's called The Bandit Queen.
right.
And he was, honestly, he was having a lot of trouble. And he was, I think, afraid at some level that he was sort of losing his powers. And in order to distract himself, he sort of took on me. this young,
and Adam, just to interject for a second for the audience to know, Bradshaw had previously written a bunch of stuff for Esquire, but then he'd taken 4 years to write a biography of Libby Holman.
Right.
So there was a gap from the last time he had done a big journalistic piece. And this piece, The Bandit Queen, that he did for you, entailed with him traveling to India, and it was a pretty ambitious piece.
It was very ambitious, and it was, he didn't think he got what he needed out of this thing. And when you actually read the piece again, which I hadn't read in 30 years, you can see how he artfully worked around his sort of crushing disappointment. And it actually makes that the entire engine of the piece in a kind of amazing and extremely artful way. But at the time, he was full of doubt, and he was full of doubt of himself as a writer, and yet he was this absolutely charming, swashbuckling, romantic man, who, I just couldn't spend. I didn't spend that much time with him, but I couldn't spend enough time with him. It was just he was my idea, my sort of platonic idea of what a sort of journalist of his era was. And they really weren't mostly like him. He was it. They were actually like, they pretended to be, they had that kind of written persona, but if you met them, they would be disappointing.
I was going to ask you that, Adam. We have, most journalists don't become famous to regular readers, right? But if we look back at the 70s, Tom Wolfe obviously was somebody who became best-selling books. Gates Halise, as you mentioned, both of those guys were very nattily dressed, always very smartly dressed, known for how well, they dressed. Or someone like David Halberstam was handsome and tall. And, how is Bradshaw's charm and persona different from that of other journalists?
Well, I mean, there were a lot of writers who, unlike the writers now, there was a great deal of effort put into the sort of persona walking around the world. So they would dress in a certain way, or they would behave certain ways in cocktail parties, and and being a writer often involved in a very elaborate social life. I mean, it was a social performance as much as it was a written performance. And the difference with Bradshaw is just exactly what Anne was saying, was that it was uncynical.
Yeah.
It was sweet.
It was sweet.
It was generous. He was a kind man, while also being absolutely, fabulously mesmerizing. I mean, the kindness was not, didn't neuter him. It was the opposite. It ennobled him. And, and
was that unique is that strange for journalists or not necessarily?
I think the sort of kindness in general, I don't want to say that journalists are not kind and generous.
Right.
Them are, but Bradshaw was special. He just was. And and that would made him different. And most I would say the most writers of that era were, sort of skeptical, bitter is that word, because that's what drives you. That's basically what makes you a journalist. It's like you have to be a little angry to be a journalist. It's like part of the DNA.
But Adam, was it also part of that post Woodward and Bernstein kind of like journalists can be a rock star now kind of a thing?
Well, except that I don't think they saw their tradition as Woodward and Bernstein.
Right.
They saw their tradition. As I said before, the people that they were competing with were
literary
writers.
Yeah.
They were not, there was a different kind of journalist who came out of the Woodward and Bernstein thing.
Yes.
I think the writers today, the journalists today are much more interested in the Woodward and Bernstein
model
lineage than they're more interested in having impact. And their impact would be political impact or investigative impact. All of that, all great. But they want to change the world. I don't think that Bradshaw wanted to change the world. I think that what he wanted to do was he loved stories, and he was a storyteller.
Yep.
And that's what that there's not that much of that anymore.
Yeah.
And can you speak to this a little bit? Bradshaw clearly had this persona, bigger than most. Captivating. And yet he wasn't a self-promoter. I mean, we look at the 60s. You think about the 80s as when real careerism, becomes part of the zeitgeist, But certainly Tom Wolfe was plenty ambitious in the 60s and was a self-promoter. And I'm not saying that as a knock. I'm just saying that was part of it. What's the difference between having a persona like Bradshaw's, but not necessarily being a self-promoter?
The other word that came up a little bit, I'm going to answer this, but the swaggering and that kind of thing, those aren't words I'd use for Bradshaw. When you think of a swaggering journalist or somebody, it's larger than life. It's an aggressive thing. Bradshaw didn't come in his persona, and he didn't enter a room aggressively. He slipped in looking, he was just charming and fun and warm. And he also knew his own persona. There was a kind of sweet winkingness about his own persona. You never felt like he was really putting you on or, did you believe it? There was a little bit of a, I know what I'm doing here and you know what I'm doing here, but aren't we having fun doing this? And oh boy, yeah, we are. Because he was smart and because he wasn't me, because of the sweetness. So it was very, very different. The journalists I knew back when, and I knew most of them, the edges were harder. The edges were just harder. And one of the things that made Bradshaw so palatable in company was the edges were not hard. There was a softness almost to him, even as he was, he could be competitive, certainly on the tennis court. You read the stories about backgammon and all of that stuff. We were once playing, I have to tell, Scott reminded me of the story. One late night, we were playing ping pong outside, and Bradshaw loved to bet and he loved to win. And of course, we all love to win. So we were playing and he said something about, $20 or $100 or, double down on the next serve. So I, of course, say, yeah. He grabbed a grapefruit off the tree behind me in the dark of night and smashed it across the table. I, of course, didn't return it. Just games and love and warmth. And I just want to say something about Carolyn, too, because Bradshaw having all of this charm and being seductive, but it wasn't hard-edged. And you didn't feel that he was after you as a female. I mean, I spent a lot of time with Bradshaw around a lot of other women. When he got married, the family man he became, he loved that. He loved the fact that he had morphed into that. And when Shannon was little, and I remember Carolyn and he would bring her to the house. And it was so funny watching this sort of glorious, appealing journalist, and he would set Shannon on the table in one of those plastic trays that we put our babies in, and with one hand feed her while, sipping wine. And you could see again, now it's the persona of the happy family man, but he meant it. You were in on the new incarnation of the Bradshaw you loved, and he took you along with the story. So I don't know. It's just it is a very, in my experience, unique person, unique amounts of joy.
Yeah, and Anne, one of the things that I was really struck with talking with you, and then tons of other folks, both the Fionas, Fiona Lewis and
Right.
Fiona Montague and Emma Soames, so many beautiful people. You look at the material that we have in the book, and apart from the Bandit Queen,
Right.
it's a very masculine book,
Yeah.
and I would say straight masculine.
Yeah.
I mean, Bradshaw writes about a very sort of macho kind of world. Those are the
Right.
subjects that seem to interest him. And yet he seemed, at least socially, to be friends with men and women alike. And you'd almost, I just read the Philip Roth biography. You read about mid-century men and masculinity and their
Yes.
attitudes towards sex. It's complicated, and sometimes now looking back on it, very upsetting in certain ways.
Right.
But Bradshaw see on the surface of it, you might pin him for a kind of misogynistic guy, but he doesn't seem to have had those qualities at all, did he?
No, I'd say the same thing about the edges. When we were talking about the edges, he did not come with masculine edges, and I say that very approvingly. It just as appealing, and I mean, I think he appealed to everybody. I mean, and there was no hard sell mid-century World War II, post-World War II masculinity to him. That I would have found that, and did find it in the people I ran into it off-putting. That was not part of it. As charming and seductive as he was, it did not come with those edges. That's my experience, Adam.
Yeah, me too. I mean, It was he wasn't that kind of guy.
No,
You're describing, and that kind of guy really existed. There were
Right.
Oh, the world and journalism, as you point out, because you have to have a certain amount of aggression to get out there, confront the world, get the pieces, and do all that. And he was able to do that. But I just would, if we're gonna lose ourselves, I just want to go back to the pieces, because I do hope people read them. I mean, if you read the Auden piece and see what that journalism at that point in time could be good like that. That is a fabulous and enduring magazine profile of that time, I think.
Absolutely.
I think the book is full of them. You know, and what I started to say when I was talking about the Bandit Queen was that I didn't really even know I was not as familiar with the sort of life's work of Bradshaw as I probably ought to have been. I should have been more curious about it, but I wasn't. And this was my first introduction to quite a lot of his work, and I was really impressed. I mean, and I was really not, and I just found it joyous.
Yeah, me too, joyous.
I don't know if you guys found this at all in him personally, but one thing that I found about the pieces is a theme that runs across them, particularly when he's writing about the gamblers, but even in the profile of Billy Wilder or the profile of Auden, there is a sense of nostalgia for an older period of time. And I'm saying like maybe the 40s or the 50s. So it's funny, this book is very, very focused on the 1970s, and there's pieces on the, Maxwell's Plum and the Beverly Hills Hotel, which feel so 70s, right? With the medallions and our stuff. But Bradshaw was this character then, this chronicler, and yet he seemed to be a kind of a throwback to something a little bit earlier than that. Was that a sense that you got from him personally as well?
Well, I think when Adam was talking about the literary lineage, that was certainly came from earlier. He was borrowing from that, I think. Yeah, I think there was something sort of old-fashioned about him in a sense, that in a courting kind of way. Yeah, I was struck by the number of pieces that were, I mean, the Gambler pieces, the Auden piece. There were a lot of old men in the pieces.
Yes.
What's interesting is the way Anne was describing his sort of non-macho
Yeah.
thing. Really, you see it very vividly in the Polo Lounge story, the Beverly Hills Hotel story,
Right.
where that encounter with that sort of pseudo prostitute, and
Yes.
and he's kind of protective of her.
Yes.
And there's nothing exploitative in the
Right.
way he's dealing with this very kind of I think difficult material to write about, and yet his persona, as it sort of always is in all of the stories. I mean, because I find that when I was reading the whole thing, the thing that I was most impressed with was, and you described this before, was his sort of the control of the persona. It was like he was absolutely in control of it, and all the stories employ it. All the stories employ. They're not like here are all the adventures I got into. They're more like here am I, the sort of chronicler, the Nick Carraway, the lens, but the lens with like flesh and blood. So that's it's a sort of beautiful creation, the Bradshaw in these pieces, and I just was struck by that over and over again.
That's a great. I love that.
Yeah,
Nick Carraway. That's really
that is perfect.
Good. That is perfect.
So guys, we're gonna wrap up now. But there was one question that I got that I wanted to ask. Two questions. One that I can answer myself. Somebody asked why the title of the book is "The Ocean Is Closed." Well, Bradshaw at one point before he passed away was going to write a series of, I guess, sort of spy novels after a character named Rafferty, which was based on him. And he and Carolyn went to do research at a hotel in Miami. I guess there used to be a hotel that was part of the airport, the Miami airport, actually. And they stayed there, and they went down to the beach one day, and there was a sign that said, "The ocean is closed." And Bradshaw just thought that was the most hilarious thing. And he was going to title the first of these novels, "The Ocean is Closed." So once we found out, we thought that was evocative, and we thought, well, that would be fun for the title of it.
Yeah,
but the one question I wanted to pose to both of you guys, and Anne, we could start with you, is what do you think Bradshaw would make of journalists today? I mean, again, he died 5 years before the internet.
Oh, it's hard. It's just a wholly different world. I mean, as Adam said, there is a lot of good journalism still being done. We don't want to sound like antediluvian ourselves. I think he would know what was good. I think he would find young writers whose voices are strong and who are not competing and are not, practicing gotcha journalism and all those kinds of things that are. He'd probably be he'd be older, content. We hope have, maybe grandchildren, maybe be in Marfa. I don't know. I think that he would rest easy. I mean, Bradshaw wasn't snarky. I don't think you look at things today and say, "Oh, but they didn't." That's just not who he was. I think he would be happy that he came along when he did, because he really suited the era, and the era suited him.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think he'd just be wistful, really.
Yeah.
The era itself is so different, and I mean, if you just think like a little structurally, nobody could afford the kind of journalism
That's another thing.
that he practiced, and that so many of his compatriots practiced. The economics of journalism were completely different.
Yeah.
And he would look and say, well, there's no place for what I used to do, but maybe he'd be doing something different. So yeah.
Well, he'd be writing novels, or he'd be writing scripts. He wouldn't be on Twitter, I don't think.
Yeah. No, probably not. I just want to say to Anne, though, you were very nice before. And I don't want this to sound like that we're so different in age, because we're not. But when I read particularly the two Truman Capote pieces and the two Ted Kennedy pieces, that was one of the main reasons I wanted to get into journalism. And that was one of the main reasons that I wanted to edit the Times Magazine, really, because I saw what it could be, because you brought it there. So anyway, just wanted to say that.
I deeply appreciate that.
That's beautiful. Well, you guys, I'm really honored that you spent some time with us. I'm sorry Scott had some technical difficulties and couldn't join us, but just for the audience to know, Scott Berg, decorated biographer and also a dear friend of Anne's, Anne Bradshaw's, was really instrumental in this book coming together and giving me a real understanding of who Bradshaw was. Scott, who is extremely busy himself, and he's writing a biography of Thurgood Marshall right now, took an inordinate amount of time to be helpful for me and give me a full picture of Bradshaw. And really, for me, this was a dream project simply because of the folks that I never got to meet Bradshaw, but I did get to meet all of you, and that's been incredibly, incredibly enriching. So thank you guys so much. Thank you, Carolyn, Books and Books, Christina, for having us here. And to everyone who's joined us, we really appreciate it, and we hope that you deeply enjoy this this collection and work of Jon's.
I have to say that this has been a marvelous conversation, but we have been trying behind the scenes to get Scott on. He has been trying. He tried at least 5 times to come on and join us. So I'm apologizing on his behalf, on our behalf. He really wanted to be here with us tonight. He had so many stories that he wanted to share. So maybe we need a part 2.
Mm-hmm.
And we do this again at some point. So I want to thank you so much. This was such a great program. And it really made Jon Bradshaw come alive. So thank you for your time, for joining us in our virtual bookshop. I hope that we will see you in person in Miami soon. And I will remind all our viewers watching from everywhere that you can order a copy of the book by just pressing the green button at the bottom of the screen. We'll ship it right out to you. If you're in Miami and you want to come by one of our stores, you can get it there. And I'll just say good night and thank you for a really, really remarkable program.
Thank you, guys. See
Thank
you.
you.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Thank you so much.